big part of what I try to do is help encourage people to embrace those garden and wayside weeds that are so important to our pollinators, that represent such an important part of our flora, especially in urban fringe environments. So that's going to be one of the things we're looking at. But first, we're going to take a shallow dive into what we mean by wildflowers and talk a little bit about their evolution. So, after the insects, the most species-rich group of organisms on Earth are the angiosperms. That's angiosperm, if you know your botanical Latin, means a covered seed, or a seed in a case. But for our purposes, it means flowering plants. So angiosperms, of course, includes grasses and a lot of wind pollinated species of trees. But when we use the term wildflowers, we tend to refer to, bear with me, we tend to refer to lower growing species of angiosperm that are insect pollinated. So that means they have these flowers that are attractive to insects, and the insects play a role in transferring the pollen between the flowers. So typically these cornfield annuals, these poppies and cornflowers and such like that you see in this photo by Paul Hobson of a planted wildflower meadow. That's what we tend to think of when we think of wildflowers. So we typically exclude trees, as I say. Most trees are much more closely related. Most broadleaf trees certainly are much more closely related to flowers like the ones in this picture than they are to coniferous trees. There's the phrase "no such thing as a fish" because the clade fish are not a true clade. It's a paraphyletic group. Trees are a polyphyletic group, so we use that word to describe the growth form of a plant and not its evolutionary relationships. So also, not all wildflowers, or not all the plants that we think of as wildflowers, are native. We can divide plants into archaeophytes and neophytes, that is, plants that were here before 1500, and species that arrived and colonized Britain with the help of human beings more recently than then. But lots of the really familiar and beautiful wild plants that we love and that insects depend on are non-natives. This beautiful bright orange dandelion family plant, this fox and cubs that you can see in the right hand picture, is an example, and it's not a native flower. It was introduced as a garden plant probably in the 17th century, but just look how beautiful it is with those fiery bright orange petals. What a color that is. And weeds are wildflowers. So the dandelions in your lawn are truly wildflowers, and they're a great source of early nectar for pollinators like this marbled white, sorry, I beg your pardon, this green veined white butterfly here in this photo I took. No Mow May is a popular initiative promoted by a great number of people, and it does help. I mean, no mow April, May, June, July, and the first half of August would perhaps be even better. But letting the dandelions in the lawn thrive and flower really does do something for the pollinating insects. And of course, it's not just dandelions. A good lawn, in my view, will contain any number of species, speedwells and daisies, and some of the low-growing cranesbills and things can all survive sometimes in a mown lawn, so long as it's mown fairly gently and infrequently. So embrace the weeds in your garden or community space. Love those unexpected wildflowers. They are a treat, and they are a thing of beauty, and they are an important part of our biodiversity. Many non-native plants exist that aren't considered invasive. Some are considered invasive, but the vast majority are not. So this is a quote from Charles Darwin from a letter to his friend, and what his abominable mystery was concerned the evolution of such a fantastic diversity of wildflowers as we have on Earth. The diversity of plants that gives us this beautiful scene in this photo by Paul Lane of these lovely bluebells and beautiful yellow archangel, which will be the type of scene that a lot of us will have been enjoying when we've potted down in the woods at perhaps at Hanningfield or at Worley Place. And so Darwin found, excuse me, Darwin found the evolution of plants and their diversification to be an abominable mystery. So the first flowering plants, the first angiosperms, as they're called, seem to appear in the Jurassic period around 140 million years ago. So that's when Diplodocus was wandering the Earth before being cast in bronze in the Natural History Museum garden. Um, and so that's known largely from pollen evidence. Pollen, of course, in the geological record, very well studied, very important, for instance, in the oil industry for gauging the age of rocks. So we know quite a lot about the pollen record of plants. By the Cretaceous period, about 100 million years ago, so that's when Spinosaurus was dropping his teeth all over the Kem beds in Morocco, and when Iguanodon was finding a place to quietly die where he would later be found by Gideon Mantell's wife. 100 million years later, angiosperms had come to dominate the landscape. And that rapid diversification is the core of Darwin's abominable mystery. We're not going to solve that today, of course. Darwin was a far greater mind than myself, and also knew a fair bit more about plants than I do. So pollination is one of the drivers of the diversity of flowering plants that we see around the world. So insects such as moths, bees, hoverflies, like this little scaver hoverfly, seen here visiting some green alkanet in a churchyard in Chelmsford, um, are attracted by the flowers. The flowers have co-evolved to look inviting to these insects, and they typically are going to access nectar, which is their sort of reward for pollination and an important source of energy and nutrition. The only source of energy and nutrition for a lot of taxa of insects in their adult forms. So pollen sticks to the hairs on the bodies of these insects and is transferred from plant to plant, where the pollen can then germinate and affect pollination, affect fertilization, I should say, on the female plants parts of the flower. So I've included this photo because I really love it. I'm very pleased with it. It's one of my favourites. And this is shows two pollinators, two bees. We're all very well aware of bees as pollinators. On the left-hand side is a domestic honeybee, one of the most numerous species of bee in the world, currently found probably in greater numbers than have ever existed on planet Earth, as it's a very popular farm animal, so to speak, for the honey that it produces. But it is also a very effective pollinator, with consuming pollen and taking pollen back to its nest for its larvae, of course. And here it is visiting this thistle on our reserve in Cranham Marsh near Upminster, much to the annoyance of a fellow social bee, the buff-tailed bumblebee that you see here on the right. So those are two examples of pollinators. Here are three more. Moths, of course, very important pollinators, relatively seldom seen because they fly at night. So we're not quite as tuned into the role of moths as pollinators as we might be. Um, on the right, a pair of red soldier beetles, Rhagonica fulva, seen here on the flowers of an umbellifer of some kind. It may be cow parsley. I'm not entirely sure. And here they are, taking pollen from these flowers of beetles, a very important pollinator, some of the oldest, earliest pollinators on Earth. And if you think of the diversity of beetles that exist, perhaps pollination is part of the explanation for that. And at the bottom left-hand corner, of course, a bee fly, seen here again visiting green alkanet, a non-native species that pollinators seem to go absolutely mad for. This is a bee fly, rather adorable in its adult form. Of course, it's a kleptoparasite on solitary bees in its larval form, so it does have a dark side, but I think they're rather attractive as they buzz around, particularly at this time of year with their permanently extended proboscises and their lovely furriness. And here are some more pollinators. So the photo on the left, appropriately taken in Scotland with the Scottish thistle there. Unfortunately, photobombed by another angiosperm that we wouldn't consider a wildflower, wind pollinated grass. But you can see there the bee beetles, showing the role of beetles as important pollinators, and a dark green fritillary butterfly and also a hoverfly that we're familiar with. And again, on the right, there's an Eristalis hoverfly, again on cow parsley, enjoying those big umbellifer flowers. So where did pollination begin? So actually, I was quite surprised to learn that the first insects pollinated plants weren't angiosperms at all, but they were gymnosperms living during the Jurassic period, when gymnosperms that were wind pollinated would secrete a little, a small amount of a sticky substance to trap the wind-blown pollen. And insects came to feed on this, beetles and some others. And they grew this mutualistic relationship eventually with the plant evolved as the plants played this inconvenience to their advantage and began using insects to transport their pollen. And here on the left, you can see a pollinator of those gymnosperms from the Jurassic. Gymnosperm means naked seed, to those of you who know your botanical Greek. And it refers to quite a lot of non-flowering plants, including all the conifers and cycads and ginkgos that continue to exist to this day. I've used that photo of a yew tree as an example, simply of a modern gymnosperm. Yew isn't insect pollinated, but it does rely on a relationship with birds to distribute its seeds. And the calligrammatid lacewing fossil on the left, from the upper Jurassic, it looks like a butterfly, doesn't it? But it is a lacewing, and it's an example of convergent evolution. So you have these two groups of insects separated on the tree of life and separated by millions of years of evolution and geological time as well. But they've evolved this similar forms for similar lifestyle. And this lacewing, a neuropteran, not a lepidopteran, even though it did, I believe, have pigment from scales on its wings, was nectaring these Jurassic gymnosperm plants and pollinating them. But the gymnosperm plants of the Jurassic that were insect pollinators are not the ancestors of flowers. What we see here is another example of convergent evolution. So magnolias and water lilies represent some of the oldest living taxa of flowering plants, generally regarded as a sister clade to the to the gymnosperms, insects pollinated or wind pollinated, like the vast majority of them. And these, when they first emerged, were universally pollinated by beetles. So they had simple flowers with very accessible pollen on the stamens that could allow beetles to come in and get dusted with pollen and then fly to the next flower and pollinate it. So they didn't require specialist evolutionary adaptations to access the nectar. And so here's a modern living flower. This is a bramble flower, and a longhorn beetle, Rupelta maculata, is feeding from that flower, taking nectar from that bramble flower, and will distribute pollen to the next one. Longhorn beetles are pollinators too. A lot of people don't think of beetles as pollinators, but they certainly are. Um, they are the OG pollinators, in fact. And I think this is a particularly attractive example. This photo was taken at our reserve at Worley Place, near Brentwood, a couple of years ago. And it as a larva, it feeds on dead wood, so it has another relationship in a different stage of its life, also with flowering plants. So we can really start to see how insect diversity and plant diversity have started to drive each other. You see in the photo on the left the hoverfly Ringia campestris feeding on red campion. And Ringia campestris is the hoverfly with the big beak, the big nose out the front, which is actually a sheath for a long proboscis that it's using to access the nectar inside these red campion flowers. And here on the right, feeding on an invasive rhododendron ponticum up in Scotland, is a narrow bordered bee hawk moth. And you can see there that really long proboscis and that hovering motion that hawk moth has while it feeds from the long flower tubes of these rhododendrons. A similar moth that you might encounter around here, particularly at this time of year and in autumn as well, is the hummingbird hawk moth, which is another little beauty with an extremely long proboscis that you will see hovering next to these long tubed flowers. So we're going to the tropics very briefly. We'll be back soon, almost immediately. Don't worry about that. This is Darwin's orchid, and Darwin encountered this orchid during his global travels, and he hypothesized that there must be a moth with a proboscis long enough to reach the nectary at the back of this orchid, down that long flowering tube, as illustrated in this beautiful 19th century artwork of it. And on the left is that very hawk moth, Morgan's sphinx, Xanthopan morganii predicta, the subspecies name, of course, referring to Darwin's prediction. And I wanted to show you one with its tongue out, but unfortunately, all the ones showing the length of the proboscis, all the photos I could find showing the length of the proboscis were of set specimens, and I thought we'd probably rather look at a photo of the moth in life, um, which is what we've got here. And you can see that big bulge on the front of the head that conceals that enormous proboscis. But specialist flowers and incredibly specialized relationships between flowers and pollinators aren't limited to the tropics. This is a very familiar plant here on the right. This is Lords and Ladies Arum maculatum, known for coming into leaf at about the same time as wild garlic. So one that we're all warned not to mistake for wild garlic or take home in our bundles. Probably best not to pick too much wild garlic in the wild anyway. And this specialist plant relies on a single species of owl midge called Psychoda phalaenoides. And Psychoda phalaenoides is one of the little tiny moth-like midges that hold their wings back behind their bodies and resemble a little a little tiny moth, but they're not. They are midges. Um, they're not non-biting midges, and the larvae feed on dung. They grow in dung. So um, the uh, the flowers of lords and ladies are said to have a rather unfortunate smell that is very, very attractive to the female midge, who mistakes it for a breeding site. And so she lands on the back of the flower and slides down and finds herself caged by a line of hairs at the bottom of the plant inside the flower, where she brushes against the stamens, the male parts of the flower, and finds herself dusted in pollen. And then after a short while, once it's caught a few owl midges in that way, she uh, the hairs drop, and she's able to escape and hopefully find another arum and make the same mistake again. And this time, hopefully, that arum will be further along in its development, and she will find herself trapped slightly deeper in the flower and will brush the pollen off onto the female parts of the flower. And arum can't self-pollinate; they are reliant on an insect, specifically this single species of owl midge, bringing pollen from one plant to another. And so that is a truly remarkable and specialized relationship between a pollinator and a wildflower right here in the woods of southern England. So the arum maculatum could be described as deceptive to its pollinators. Um, And most orchids, unlike Darwin's orchid, don't offer nectary rewards to their pollinators. Their invitations to insects are a trick. And the bee orchid is famously an example of a flower that takes this trickery to unusual extremes. So they're thought to mimic a female bee. And the hope is that a male bee will come and attempt to mate with the bee that is the lip of the flower, and will get pollen transferred onto his back, which he will then, promising himself he'll never make the same mistake again, no doubt, does make the same mistake again and delivers that pollen to another bee orchid. But in reality, most British bee orchids are not pollinated this way. Most of them are self-pollinated. It's believed that the density of the types of bee that are attracted to it are too low. So pollination, this method of pollination is not without risk um, for um, for wildflowers. Pollinators can sometimes carry and transmit plant pathogens. So this is essentially a bit like a sexually transmitted disease for flowers. This is Campion anther fungus. And this is the fungal spores will attach themselves to a pollinator, and then the pollinator will quite unintentionally, of course, deliver those fungal spores to another red campion flower, and the fungus will develop around the anthers, around the male parts of the flower. And it's quite a sad sight to see all these smut stained campion flowers. It can infect quite a lot of campion flowers. So particularly towards the end of the flowering season, do do go and have a look at banks of campion, and you might see this fungus at work. That's of course not the only relationship that fungi and wildflowers have. Many fungi and wildflowers have symbiotic relationships through their mycorrhizal networks, which are the fungal associations between plants and their roots. But we're not gonna go into that today. It would be far too complicated. So pollination isn't the only way that plant diversity can drive insect diversity. Most herbivorous insects select one species or a small suite of species of plant to feed on. And the reason for this, the reason they can't be more generalist in their tastes, is that most plants have some form of defense compounds. So that's things that are toxic or indigestible, um, particularly in the deciduous trees. Those indigestible compounds are what deters caterpillars. They all have these specific anti-feed compounds, um, or specific defenses against grazing invertebrates. Um, and so obviously that drives speciation in insects, as of course they need to find a mate with the same they grew up with the same resistances that it did, and that drives the speciation of insects. Some take it one step further and take the toxic compounds from the plants they eat into their bodies and use aposematic colouring to avoid predators, like this rather wonderful cinnabar moth on some lovely ragwort um, is doing. So some wildflowers are parasitic or hemiparasitic on other plants. The broom rapes are one example, fully parasitic on other plants, not even producing their own chlorophyll, but taking all of their energy and nutritional needs from other plants. And another example is the hemiparasitic yellow rattle, which is takes some of its energy and some of its nutrients grass from grasses and grass hosts. And that's why where yellow rattle grows in a meadow, it can reduce the competition that other wildflowers face from meadows and face from grasses, and can actually contribute to an increased floristic diversity through its hemiparasitism. So that was a rundown of some of the relationships that plants have with insects and with other plants. But now we're going to move on and just indulge a little bit in the wonder of some of our weeds. And I'm afraid the credit in the corner of that photo is wrong. That's not a photo by Dave Sutton. That's a photo by me of a small tortoiseshell butterfly enjoying some oxeye daisies. The cow parsley, this is a nice plant to look out for. This is a big white hedgerow umbellifer. They have these huge white umbels or umbrellas, if you will, of small white simple flowers that are loved by particularly by generalist pollinators like this hoverfly that we might have seen before. So they're loved by some of the diptera that pollinate, and they're also loved by some beetle pollinators as well. And this is another of my favourites. This is a real beauty. This is rosebay willow herb, Camerian angustifolium. And it's the bright pink star of disturbed brownfield sites. It can form these huge banks of flowers on railway embankments. It's sometimes called fireweed. It had actually been a very rare woodland plant until about the time of the Fire of London, the Great Fire of London, when in 1666, obviously, scorched bare ground suddenly and unexpectedly became available. And the highly dispersive wind-blown seeds of fireweed immediately took opportunity to use those sites. And of course, it also grew up during the Second World War and after the Second World War on the many bomb sites that dotted Britain's cities and obviously cities all over northwest Europe. It's also the larval food plant of the elephant hawk moth. If you want to look at an elephant hawk moth, do go to our YouTube channel and have a look at my earlier webinar about butterflies, moths, and their caterpillars and gardening for them. It truly is one of our most beautiful moths and one of our most exciting caterpillars. A big elephant's trunk looking thing with black snake's eyes and a big spike on its back end. It's a really spectacular looking caterpillar. So embrace that great mighty fireweed. This is another plant of disturbed ground, a classic cornfield annual, the poppy, a beautiful Simple little flower that used to dot our cornfields, of course, before we came along with sprays and such like that put paid to that show of colour. And it's of course because it thrives in disturbed ground. It grew very abundantly on the battlefields of the First World War, and thus became such an important symbol of the First World War and of remembrance. And we see that design a lot this year with all the important historic anniversaries, of course, that we're observing. So this is another of my favourite wayside weeds, so to speak. This is ragwort. It is a native plant. There was a non-native plant related to ragwort called Oxford ragweed that was in the news when I was a kid. But this is very much a native plant. It's loved by the cinnabar moth larvae that we saw in an early slide, and it's fed upon by a huge range of pollinators. It's fully native. I urge you to embrace and tolerate ragwort, unless you grow hay or keep horses, or if your neighbour grows hay or keeps horses. And that is an important caveat because if it gets into hay that is fed to horses, it can be lethal. So that is an important caveat. Horse people aren't wrong, but where there's no risk of horses being exposed to it, I think it's a great plant. And its anti-feed compounds really do seem to deter a lot of creatures from eating it. I've seen stands of ragwort tall and proud, where the grass has been grazed to millimeters by geese or rabbits, and they won't eat this. And this is another of my favourites. This is green alkanet. Its leaves no greener than those of many other flowering plants, and I think those flowers look to be a particularly dazzling shade of blue. It can dominate in some ecosystems. It can be a bit of a thug, but it is a beautiful flower. That colour, I think, is fantastic. It was introduced 300 years ago as an ornamental garden plant, and I can entirely see why. And bees like this red mason bee absolutely love it. So next time you're at Fingering Hoe Wick Nature Reserve, if that's a place that you sometimes head to, do check out the green alkanet around the car park there, and just have a look at how much use the bees from the bee hotel, the big bee hotel outside the centre, are getting from that plant. Here's another lovely wildflower. This is bird's foot trefoil, Lotus corniculatus, seen here being nectared on by a small skipper butterfly. Rather beautiful plant, capable of growing even in relatively short grass because of its relatively low growing stature. And that's the food plant of the common blue butterfly. So that lovely little blue butterfly of open grasslands, its strange stocky caterpillar, with its ant attendants will graze on the leaves of bird's foot trefoil, and the caterpillars of some of the burnet moths as well can be found on bird's foot trefoil. It's a member of the pea family, and yeah, it's one of my favourites. And this is another iconic flower, the bluebell. I don't know if I might accidentally have included a photo of Spanish bluebell, but this is the bluebell, and it's a woodland flower, and it flowers early in the year before the canopy can close and shade them out. And so they're an iconic seasonal spectacular, probably well past their best now, but I'm sure many of us over the last couple of months have been enjoying a walk in the bluebell woods. And here's another early spring woodland flower that bursts into life before that canopy closes and shades them out. This is wood anemone, and it's found in ancient woodlands, which it prefers because it grows quite slowly and spreads quite slowly. And rather adorably, its flowers close and nod at night, and it's loved by hoverflies and also by some flower beetles as a source of nectar and pollen. And I did promise, this is the last one for that section. I did promise to talk about ivy in as many presentations as I could possibly shoehorn it into, because I love it so much. Ivy has flowers and it isn't a tree, therefore it's a wildflower. It has interesting green flowers that are more fascinating, I think, the more I look at them. In this lovely macro photo by Jane Addams, you can see this fantastic little green flower. It's vital for so much wildlife. It's year-round cover for birds, roosting birds, nesting birds, small mammals. It's late summer nectar for creatures like this specialist mining bee, the last mining bee of the year to come out on the wing, Caletes hederae, the ivy mining bee, or the ivy Caletes, as it's sometimes called, a lovely solitary bee that specializes in ivy. It doesn't kill trees. It can occasionally put weight on some of the very oldest of trees, but it's not a killer of trees. So do let it thrive and let it go on. And even if it did, as I've said before, standing deadwood is a great habitat supporting creatures, including the larvae of that lovely longhorn beetle we saw in a previous slide. So here in Essex, we've got a number of great reserves where you can get to go and see some of the wildflowers. This photo here was taken at Roding Valley Meadows, which was one of the first Essex Wildlife Trust sites at which I volunteered. It has some ancient hay meadows managed for hay for centuries, consistently. Some of the finest floodplain meadows in the south of England. It's readily accessible by public transport. You can get there on the Central Line. And for any of you who have a passing interest in military history, it was also a former RAF barrage balloon base on part of the site, and you can see some of the relics of that period as you walk the trails there. But at this time of year, May, June, it's a great time to go and visit and see plants like this devil's bit scabious in bloom in its fantastic hay meadows before they're harvested in July and August, as they have been for hundreds of years. So much less ancient, but by no means less interesting. This was actually the first site at which I volunteered for Essex Wildlife Trust, Chafford Gorges. So it's a brownfield, it's a former quarry site, and it's a fantastic spot for orchids like these common spotted orchids, photographed by the former warden Matthew McGettigan there. And Chafford Gorges is it's a lovely place to have a stroll, a lovely place to go and botanize. It's also got some fantastic insects. One of the gorges is designated as a triple SI for its insects, another for its remarkable geology. But for me, the orchids really are the star of the show. So it's well worth getting down there this time of year, or perhaps next month. It's a good place to go and have a look for orchids. And it is a reminder too that so many of these ex-industrial sites around Essex have been lost to development and continue to be lost to development. Whilst Chafford is, of course, safe with us, it's a great place to familiarise yourself with what a brownfield site can look like, and so you can understand some of the wildlife that makes use of what industry leaves behind. This is a bit of a wild card as our nature reserves go. This is Worley Place near Brentwood, and it's used to form the grounds of a stately home to Ellen Wilmot, a famous horticulturalist, and she and her gardeners bred many new varieties of cultivated plant on the site at Worley Place. If you ever come across plants with a varietal name, so not a scientific name, but a varietal name of Miss Wilmot or Ellen Wilmot, then that variety will have been selectively bred by Miss Wilmot and her gardeners at Worley Place near Brentwood. That's now managed partly as a nature reserve and partly as a historic garden by Essex Wildlife Trust. And it's really a fascinating blend of the native and the exotic in terms of plant life. So go there and have a look at the excellent signage that the volunteers there have put in place to explain what you're looking at. It really is a magical little woodland to walk around, and you can also see the remains, the footings of some of the buildings, some of the greenhouses that Ellen Wilmot and her gardeners used to work in. So those are my top three picks for wildflower sites around Essex Wildlife Trust. I do apologise to those of you in the north of the county, but I wanted to shed some light on some of our more metropolitan sites. So orchids. Orchids are some of our most beautiful wildflowers. Many of us are very familiar with tropical orchids, like the Phalaenopsis, that you get in white pots that are sold at supermarkets, garden centres, and motorway services up and down the country. And they are rather beautiful. They seem to be absolutely loved and very heavily invested in by some. Pruned using only sterilized scissors and such like, whereas others are just left in a corner by the fireplace, where they flower abundantly for years and years. So yeah, that's our typical image of orchids. But most British orchids are somewhat smaller than that, but I think no less beautiful. Look at this gorgeous pyramidal orchid, a photo taken on a brownfield site in Kent that is sadly no more, part of the Vision 2020 photo collection. 9 of the 57 species of orchid are found at Chafford Gorges, including the pyramidal that you saw in the previous slide. Of course, the man orchid, named because that lower petal is in the shape of a dancing man. The monkey orchid and the lady orchid are named for similar reasons. In the middle, the early marsh orchid, a lovely early summer orchid of wet places, well worth looking out for. And the bee orchid, of course, a surprisingly resilient orchid that will grow in very poor soils. So when I used to work in Derby, I used to do a job which involved driving around businesses in a van, and I was very surprised to see that even on a business park just outside Derby city centre, set on a former rail yard, when the grass wasn't mown for a few weeks, bee orchids were shooting up there, and bee orchids were growing in the car park of a fast food restaurant. There, so they can crop up in the most obscure places, not where you think. There really are beauty in urban in the urban sprawl. So do keep an eye out for them. They can crop up in a lot of places, and they're very, very beautiful. So to care for our wildflowers, what do we need to do? Well, first we need to make space for weeds. We need to be slower to use herbicides or pull them out from our gardens and lawns. You could plant, or better still, allow the natural regeneration of a mini meadow. My former line manager, Danielle Carbot, has a video on YouTube, a webinar from the series before this, the series that inspired these webinars. And that's well worth a look, because in it she details how to create a mini meadow. Or come and visit one of our reserves and just enjoy the wildflowers. So in a changing world, changes in plant distribution can tell us a lot. I haven't allowed myself time to give you a detailed rundown of how to survey wildflowers. And there are other people who could explain that far better with far more experience, I'm sure. But we need to keep an eye on how the distribution of our plant changes, because in a changing world, changes in plant distribution can tell us a lot. They can tell us about changes in soil chemistry as a result of industrial activity, for instance. And they can tell us about climate change, keep us informed about climate change, and they can tell us about the quality of our management or the success of our management through tools like the rapid grassland assessment that our conservation evidence team use. We must also ensure that our conservation actions don't endanger plants of local importance. So before we put in a pond, or before we dig up a meadow, dig up grassland to create a meadow, we need to make sure that there's not already that botanical interest lurking there. So this year, we're running the Essex Bio Blitz from April to September. We're asking members of the public and our members and yourselves, of course, to go out, photograph wildflowers, download the iNaturalist app, and add your photos to the project page and contribute to climate change research, which is being run jointly by Essex Wildlife Trust and the University of Essex. And I see that Emma has very kindly put into the chat a link to the more full instructions on how to be a part of the Essex Bio Blitz. So thank you very much for coming. I hope that was interesting. I think I have shared everything I know about wildflowers now. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and do go out and look for some flowers, and do participate in the Essex Bio Blitz and record some wildflowers on iNaturalist. So yeah, thank you very much.